you. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
The issue that I raised today is enrollment. This is an issue that's been pretty significant throughout the country. In the past 500 years, it's been the federal government's practice to determine who is Indian, who isn't, and it's based upon, and even the funding is based upon the quarter blood right now. And the federal government has always had that determination instilled in the last few centuries. In your opinion or stance on this issue, do you feel the federal government should continue this involvement? Or would you support or feel that determination should be left on the local government, the tribal governments, and those of us who have relatives at home to make the determination, who's my child, who's my grandchildren, who's my future generation?
Let me ask you a question, and that is that you want to make sure that tribes have the freedom to be able to determine who's a member. Is that what you're saying? And who is an Indian?
Yes.
To me, given the fact that the government has really intervened so mightily to try to strip Native peoples from their identity, it seems to me that the only thing that would make sense is to return the power to the Native communities to be able to determine who belongs. How could it be otherwise? Thank you.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Well, sort of.
Well, what doesn't it answer?
What it doesn't answer is if you become president, and if that determination is going to be held at the local level, and you're saying that you're going to take that recommendation from the tribes to determine.
Yes, I'm saying I'll take it from the tribes, and I will write an executive order codifying that. That's right.
And the funding will follow with it.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Next we have Chairman Ron, His Horse is Thunder from the Standing Rock Sioux.
Congressman, I have two issues for you to address this afternoon, but they are so intertwined they must be addressed at once. The two issues are law enforcement on Indian reservations and criminal jurisdiction on reservations. I want to give you two glaring statistics that will hopefully drive home the ideal that these are issues that must be addressed. One of the statistics is this, that Native American women are 2.5 times more likely to be raped or suffer from a sexual assault than any other group of women in this country. That's one. The second statistic is this, is that 1 out of every 3 Native American women in this country will be a victim of rape. Now, those two statistics are directly attributable to the lack of law enforcement in Indian country and the ideal that the federal government took away from tribes a sovereign right to prosecute criminals within our boundaries. The questions are this. Would you support legislation that would give back tribes a sovereign right to prosecute criminals within our boundaries? One. Second.
Yes.
Would you support appropriations that would increase law enforcement funding for our courts and our law enforcement personnel on reservations?
And the answer is yes to that, and let me comment on the law enforcement issues. Many of you are familiar with the Amnesty International report, which details the extent of crimes that the gentleman has just spoken about. And there is a disproportionate crime rate and also a lack of enforcement response and cooperation. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
So what we need to do is obvious. First of all, we need to make sure, and I would appoint, as your representatives have talked about, a special assistant attorney general in the Justice Department whose job it would be to work the issue of the lack of law enforcement and the lack of a response from the areas. We need cooperation. You know, at a city level, where I come from, Cleveland, we have cooperation between government at all levels. And while tribal sovereignty must be protected and respected, we also need to see that that sovereign tribe gets the cooperation of all the governmental entities in the locale. And we have to empower tribal governments to be able to address the crimes that are committed in the community. And we have to make sure that we have funding to do that. There has to be funding sources to do that. So does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay, thank you. And just a footnote about that. This issue of tribal sovereignty is critical because it relates to one of the ways in which we start to repair the breach that has been created historically in the United States. And again, just as the current President of the United States, I believe, has undermined our Constitution by using executive orders to take power away from Congress, I intend to use executive orders in a benign way to repair breaches that have been created, such as those that we are discussing today. So, thank you.
I'd like to follow up on that question before we move on. Many tribes have been involved in creating alternative justice systems such as the peacemaker courts. What could the rest of the country learn from this process of alternative forms of justice?
Well, the peacemaker court is one way in which we find a way to resolve differences without severe penalties and to bring the person back into the community. I've proposed a cabinet-level Department of Peace and Nonviolence where we look at the issues that afflict tribal community homes, domestic violence, spousal abuse, child abuse, but these happen all over America. Violence in the schools, racial violence, violence against gays, police community clashes, and the Department of Peace and Nonviolence would look towards the peacemaker courts as a model of how we can have nonviolent conflict resolution and mediation so that we can achieve a form of justice that is restorative instead of retributive. Thank you.
Our next question will be asked by Chairman Dan Jones of the Ponca Tribe of Oklahoma.
Congressman.
Sir.
Yes, we are America's first environmentalist, so that's what makes this point so sad, or this action so sad by Republican Senator Jim Inhofe. He struck a blow to tribal self-determination. He also struck a blow to state and tribal relationships when he basically slipped a midnight rider into a national transportation bill. Now, the rider limits Oklahoma tribes from governing their environmental quality of their life. And so what's so sad about this is the senator is the last living man that believes burning hydrocarbons doesn't affect our weather. And he's also Indian fighter, but we won't get into that. How would you protect tribes from these unethical legislative attacks on our sovereignty?
Well, again, by writing, to begin with, an executive order that would establish tribal sovereignty and calling on all departments of the federal government to respect tribal sovereignty to begin with. What that would then do would cause the Justice Department and all of the federal agencies to have to go to the principle of tribal sovereignty in order to resolve any matters. That would create a whole new relationship with tribal governments. It would empower tribal governments so that instead of a top-down approach, which is the specialty of a federal government, the approach then becomes collaborative. We have communication instead of a dictation. So that's the first thing.